At dawn on November 11, 1942, the Pacific was quiet, except for the sound of welding hammers echoing across the deck of a battered giant. The USS Enterprise had no right to be at sea. Her hull was dented, her elevator jammed, her decks patched with rough steel plates that glowed faintly in the morning sun. Yet, despite all visible scars, she was moving, not limping, but steaming at full speed toward battle. Behind her, in the calm waters of New Caledonia, sparks still flew from the last torches of the Seabees, who had been working without pause for 4 days. The ship wasn't ready, but time had run out. Enterprise was the only operational American carrier left in the Pacific. By that point in the war, the U.S. Navy had been nearly dismantled in the carrier ranks. Lexington had gone down at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Wasp at Guadalcanal, and Hornet at Santa Cruz just days before. Saratoga sat immobilized in Pearl Harbor, still under repair from torpedo damage. The Pacific, once a vast ocean of American presence, now held a single carrier able to launch aircraft into combat. That ship was Enterprise, designated CV-6, known to her crew simply as the Big E. She was 824 feet long, weighing over 25,000 tons, yet to the men aboard her, she was alive, a floating city that breathed, bled, and refused to stop. Her crew had endured months of near-constant fighting. Wake, Midway, the Solomons. They had seen her deck shattered, fires raging, hangars filled with smoke, and still they brought her back to life every time. The Japanese had already claimed to have sunk her 3 separate times that year. Newspapers in Tokyo even printed the news. But each time, Enterprise returned, damaged but not destroyed, her deck bristling with aircraft, her crew lined at battle stations, ready to strike again. The enemy gave her a new name, the Grey Ghost. It was meant as mockery at first, but soon it became legend. A ship that disappeared into the smoke only to rise again from the waves. Standing near the forward elevator, Lieutenant Commander Herschel Albert Smith studied the twisted plates and newly welded seams. He had memorized every bulkhead and passageway aboard Enterprise. As the ship's damage control officer, Smith knew her as a surgeon knows anatomy, each pump, pipe, and junction stored in his mind. To him, this ship wasn't steel and rivets. It was a living system. When she hurt, he knew where to look. When she faltered, he knew how to heal her. His teams were some of the best trained in the Navy, not by chance but by repetition. They practiced through nights and storms, turning drills into reflexes. They had learned to fight fires in darkness, patch ruptured pipes while waist-deep in water, and seal compartments while the ship rolled under enemy attack. To them, saving Enterprise wasn't a job, it was instinct. Smith had seen his share of crises already. In August, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, a bomb struck the flight deck just feet from where he stood. He didn't wait for reports. He sprinted into the smoke. The air was thick with fuel fumes and sparks from electrical shorts. Sailors shouted over the roar of fire hoses, their faces illuminated by the reflection of burning aluminum. Smith didn't need blueprints. He visualized the damage in his mind, calculated the spread, and issued rapid commands. Isolate circuits, vent compartments, reinforce bulkheads, pump out the portside flooding. Within minutes, the chaos turned into coordinated motion. Hours later, the fires were contained. By nightfall, flight operations resumed. The ship had been hit hard, yet she stayed in formation. That was the difference between Enterprise and the others. She refused to yield. Now, as Smith watched the Seabees finish their last welds, he knew how fragile their creation was. The steel plates covering bomb holes were little more than bandages. The warped hull could buckle if hit again in the wrong place. But he also knew the stakes. The Japanese were preparing another major offensive aimed at Guadalcanal, and without Enterprise to deliver air cover, the Marines holding the island would be isolated. There were no reserves.
No replacements.
If Enterprise didn't sail, the Pacific might fall. At 0600 hours, her new captain, Osborne Bennett Hardison, gave the order. He had been in command for only 10 days. He looked at Smith, asked a single question: "Can she fight?" Smith paused, then nodded. "She can fight." That was enough. The ship's engines roared to life, churning white wakes behind her as she headed toward the open sea. The welders stayed aboard, torches in hand, finishing repairs as the carrier picked up speed. Below decks, the air still smelled of burnt paint and salt water. The flight crews strapped into their aircraft, mechanics checking every rivet and hose. The ship groaned as waves struck her wounded hull, but she pressed on. Ahead waited the largest naval engagement since Midway, and for Enterprise, the most dangerous mission of her life. Inside the armored body of Enterprise, life was a mix of rhythm and chaos. The clang of tools and the distant hum of machinery echoed constantly through the narrow passageways. Every man aboard knew the layout by heart, not because they had to, but because their survival depended on it. In battle, seconds decided everything. Knowing the fastest route between compartments could mean the difference between sealing off flooding and losing the entire ship. Herschel Smith had drilled that reality into every member of his teams. He wasn't a loud leader or a man who inspired with speeches. He inspired through precision. When Smith walked into a compartment, sailors straightened automatically. He could glance at a system gauge or a leak and know instantly whether it was cosmetic or catastrophic. The men trusted him because he never guessed. He calculated. His authority didn't come from rank, it came from competence. Every few hours, he ran practice drills. Flooding in the portside compartments. Fire in the hangar. Power loss to the pumps. Nothing on Enterprise was left to chance. Some officers thought the constant training was excessive, even superstitious. But when the bombs began to fall, that discipline turned into survival instinct. Smith believed in what he called controlled chaos. No sailor could eliminate panic, but they could channel it. The human mind under stress tends to narrow focus, to fixate on one task and lose sight of everything else. So his philosophy was simple. Make sure the one task every man focused on was the right one. If a sailor's hands moved automatically toward the correct valve or the correct hose, panic became productivity. In the weeks before Santa Cruz, Smith had personally inspected every section of the ship. He crawled through ventilation shafts, checked bulkheads, even tested door seals with chalk and light to ensure they closed perfectly. He believed the ship herself could talk, if only you listened. The slight change in vibration when a pump struggled, the faint hiss of escaping air, the groan of a stress plate. To Smith, these were not random noises, they were warnings. And when he listened, Enterprise answered. That attention to detail paid off on October 26, 1942. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands began as another unpredictable dance of carriers and aircraft, but within minutes, it became a nightmare. The first explosion came without warning. A Japanese bomb penetrated the flight deck forward and detonated deep within the ship. Lights flickered, alarms shrieked, the air filled with dust and heat. Smith, who had been inspecting repair lockers midship, was thrown against a wall. He stood, ears ringing, and ran toward the rising smoke. By the time he reached the damaged area, the second bomb hit. The blast wave knocked men off their feet. Fuel lines ruptured, sending waves of burning liquid through the hangar. Firefighting teams were already at work, forming human chains, passing hoses, dragging the wounded to safety. Smith's orders were short and sharp. Seal frame 50. Reinforce bulkhead. Cut power here. Each command rippled outward like gears turning in a clock. Sailors who had drilled these exact scenarios dozens of times now performed automatically. It was brutal work. They fought heat that blistered skin through protective gear, smoke that made vision almost impossible, and debris that shifted underfoot with every roll of the ship. But Smith's organization held. Compartment after compartment, the damage was contained. By sunset, Enterprise was afloat, battered but operational. The Japanese had scored direct hits, but they hadn't destroyed her. Fires were extinguished. Power was restored. Aircraft elevators were jammed, but the flight deck was usable. Against all odds, she could still launch planes. That night, Smith and his exhausted men walked the scorched deck in silence. Every beam and plate bore scars, but she was alive. The next morning, as reports came in that Hornet, Enterprise's sister carrier, had gone down, the reality sank in. The entire Pacific now rested on one ship. Enterprise wasn't just damaged, she was irreplaceable. Smith stood by the forward elevator, watching welders patch fresh holes under portable lamps. Each spark was a reminder, there would be no second chances. In the Navy's records, Enterprise should have been sidelined for months. Her frame was warped, her hull cracked in places that couldn't be reached without dry dock. But the Pacific didn't have time for regulations. Repairs would happen at sea, or they wouldn't happen at all. And the man making that possible was Herschel Smith. He coordinated with the Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, men who had come from shipyards, factories, and farms. They weren't trained sailors, but they knew how to build and improvise. Under Smith's direction, they turned the carrier's flight deck into a floating workshop. Welding arcs danced under tarps as waves broke against the bow. The air smelled of burnt steel and diesel. Work never stopped, not even when the sun set. 4 days later, when Captain Hardison received orders to sail for Guadalcanal, Smith didn't hesitate. The ship wasn't ready, but the war wouldn't wait. With Seabees still working and sparks still flying, Enterprise left port once again, a wounded ship heading back into fire. To the men who served aboard her, it wasn't insanity. It was duty. The morning Enterprise left Noumea Harbour, the horizon glowed a dull orange. Welders were still at work, sparks spraying like fireworks against the grey sky. The ship's flight deck shook from air hammers as the last steel plates were fastened into place. Below decks, fuel lines hissed softly, pumps groaned, and engineers moved through the narrow corridors with grim focus. Enterprise was not in fighting condition, but she was all that remained. Every man aboard understood what that meant. The Marines at Guadalcanal were barely holding their line. Their airfield, Henderson Field, had been bombarded for weeks. Supplies were running out, and enemy ships were moving south. The Japanese planned to wipe the airfield off the map, land fresh troops, and retake the island. If that happened, months of American effort would collapse. There would be no second foothold. Without Enterprise, there would be no air cover, no reinforcements, no chance. Captain Hardison knew it. He had commanded the carrier for barely 10 days, yet in that short time, he had come to understand her personality, stubborn, scarred, and relentless. When the order to sortie came through, there was no debate. "We sail at dawn," he told the bridge crew. No one questioned him. As the carrier turned toward the open sea, her wounds were visible to anyone who looked closely. The great bulge on the starboard side marked where a near miss had bent her hull outward. The forward elevator was still jammed, held in place by cables and makeshift braces. Even the deck bore seams of rough welding where bombs had torn through days before. Fuel still leaked slowly from a ruptured tank deep below, leaving an iridescent trail in the water behind her. But the engines were sound. The catapults worked. Her air group, though blooded, was ready to fight. The pilots of Air Group 10, the Grim Reapers, gathered in the ready room that morning. Some were veterans of Coral Sea and Midway. Others had only recently joined, their first mission still ahead. They were young, most in their early 20s, some barely 19. They joked quietly as they checked their flight gear, the way combat pilots often do before takeoff, not because they felt brave, but because silence was heavier than laughter. Above them, mechanics worked miracles. Aircraft were patched with scavenged parts, bomb racks adjusted by hand, and wings repainted with rough brushstrokes. Every available plane, Wildcat fighters, Dauntless dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes, had been made flight-ready. There were no reserves left. Each pilot, each engine, each mechanic mattered. By mid-morning on November 12th, Enterprise had reached striking distance of the Solomon Islands. The air was thick with humidity, the sea unusually calm. From the bridge, Captain Hardison could see the faint outline of clouds rising over Guadalcanal, the heat plumes of distant bombardments. At 0800 hours, he gave the command, "Launch aircraft." The catapults hissed, cables snapped forward, and the first Dauntless bombers thundered into the air. One after another, the planes lifted off, circling the carrier before heading west toward the battle zone. Their target was the Japanese cruiser Kinagasa, retreating north after shelling Henderson Field the night before. At 0930, the bombers found her. The Japanese ship was steaming fast, unaware that Enterprise's air group was above. The Dauntless dive bombers began their descent from 12,000 feet. Sunlight glinted off their wings as they dove, as screaming past their canopies. Anti-aircraft guns from the cruiser opened fire, traces stitching the sky, but the Americans kept diving. At 1,500 feet, they released their bombs and pulled up hard, black smoke curling behind them. Seconds later, explosions tore through the Kinagasa's decks. One bomb struck near the bridge, another amidships. Fires erupted instantly. The ship slowed, then began to list. Within minutes, secondary explosions rippled through her hull. By early afternoon, she rolled to port and slipped beneath the waves. The pilots radioed the kill and returned to Enterprise. The flight deck crews worked at lightning speed to refuel and rearm the aircraft. There was no cheering, no celebration, just motion. The next wave was already preparing. That night, as darkness fell, the sounds of battle reached the carrier even from miles away. The sea flashed faintly with distant explosions. Somewhere beyond the horizon, American cruisers and destroyers were locked in close combat with Japanese battleships. The reports that came in described chaos, ships colliding in darkness, gunfire at point-blank range, searchlights cutting through smoke. Smith and his team stayed at their stations all night. They knew if Enterprise was spotted, she could become the next target. They double-checked every pump and fire main, every power line and watertight door. Below deck, Seabees continued welding, their faces lit by blue arcs. The air was hot and metallic, filled with the smell of ozone and oil. By dawn on November 13th, word reached the carrier. The Japanese battleship High A had been crippled in the night battle, barely afloat, retreating slowly northwest. Enterprise launched at once. Dive bombers rose again, circling upward through morning haze before diving on their new target. The High A fought back with her heavy guns, but her steering was damaged. She could not turn fast enough. Bombs and torpedoes struck home. Within hours, she was burning fiercely, motionless on the sea. That evening, the High A slipped beneath the surface. For 2 days, Enterprise had fought and won, while still under repair. Her welders had never stopped working, her deck still echoed with hammers, and her seams still leaked. But she was holding together. And now, for the first time in months, it seemed the tide at Guadalcanal might be turning. The men didn't yet know it, but these 4 days would decide the future of the Pacific. By the morning of November 14th, 1942, Enterprise was no longer a ship at sea, she was a machine of survival. Every compartment, every man, every heartbeat moved with a single purpose: keep her alive, keep her fighting. The sea around her shimmered in the pale sun, calm and deceptive, while above, aircraft engines roared to life in rapid sequence. This was the 3rd straight day of combat operations, and fatigue was visible everywhere, in the faces of pilots, in the dark circles under mechanics' eyes, in the sluggish pace of sailors who had barely slept. The carrier's corridors smelled of oil, sweat, and burnt insulation. In the mess hall, men ate in silence, leaning against bulkheads with tin trays in hand, chewing without appetite. But when the general quarters alarm rang, exhaustion vanished. Every man ran to his post automatically, trained reflex overriding fatigue. At 0600 hours, reconnaissance planes reported a new Japanese task force heading toward Guadalcanal. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transports, carrying reinforcements for the island. It was an all-in gamble by the Imperial Navy. If they could land these troops and supplies, the island would fall. Enterprise was the only Allied carrier in range to stop them. Captain Hardison gathered his senior officers in the plotting room. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Charts covered the table, marked with pencil lines showing both fleets' positions. He traced the enemy course with a ruler and said quietly, "This is it. We stop them here, or we lose Guadalcanal." At 0830, the first strike group launched. Dive bombers climbed into the sky, followed by Wildcat fighters flying escort. The air above Enterprise shimmered with heat waves as aircraft formed up into formation. Every plane that left the deck was another risk. If the Japanese found the carrier's location, she had no escorting carrier to rely on. She was alone. The attack reached the enemy around mid-morning. The Japanese fleet stretched across the sea like a dark moving city. Anti-aircraft fire erupted the moment the American planes appeared. Thick black clouds of shrapnel filled the sky. But the dauntless bombers pressed in. From 12,000 feet, they dove nearly vertical, wind howling through the dive brakes. Each pilot focused on one target, his hands steady despite the flak bursting around him. Bombs found their mark. The heavy cruiser Suzuya was struck near her bridge. The Kinagasa's sister ship hit in her aft section. Smoke and flames rose as secondary explosions rocked the vessels. Yet the attack came at a cost. Several bombers were lost, shot down before they could pull up. Others limped back to Enterprise, riddled with holes, landing on the carrier's damaged deck in a shower of sparks. As the first wave returned, deck crews worked with feverish speed. Planes were refueled, rearmed, pushed to the launch positions. Herschel Smith stood by the island superstructure, watching smoke from the welding still drift skyward from midship. His men were still making repairs even as bombs were being loaded above their heads. By noon, the second strike group was airborne, targeting the transports carrying Japanese reinforcements. This attack was decisive. Bombs rained down on the convoy, setting several transports ablaze. Others ran aground in panic, their decks engulfed in smoke. The Japanese soldiers on board could only watch as their supplies and ammunition burned. For the first time since the start of the Guadalcanal campaign, the enemy's advance was truly halted. Back on Enterprise, the toll of the day's work began to show. The flight deck was littered with fragments of debris and burnt tire marks from damaged landings. Sailors worked non-stop to clear space for incoming aircraft. The arresting wires, the thick steel cables that stopped landing planes, snapped twice under strain. Smith's teams patched them with spare sections scavenged from damaged machinery. Late that afternoon, word reached the ship of a major surface engagement off Savo Island. American and Japanese battleships were clashing again, trading heavy fire at close range. The U.S. battleship South Dakota was hit repeatedly but stayed afloat. The Washington closed in under cover of night, catching the Japanese battleship Kirishima in her sights. In less than 10 minutes, the Kirishima was wrecked beyond recovery. When the news reached Enterprise, a wave of quiet relief spread through the ship. Not cheers, just silent nods, faint smiles, and the first exhale in days. The Japanese offensive had been broken. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, it felt like the balance might finally be shifting. That night, the Pacific was eerily calm. The stars above were sharp and clear, and the water reflected their light like glass. On deck, pilots slept beside their aircraft, too tired to move. Mechanics lay down on toolboxes, helmets still on. The ship's engines hummed softly below, a constant reminder of motion, of life. Smith walked the length of the deck before turning in. He passed the patched holes, the scorched paint, the crude seams of welds that glowed faintly where heat still radiated from the day's work. He stopped at the bow and looked out at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, hundreds of ships were sinking, thousands of men drifting. Yet Enterprise still sailed, battered, bruised, but undefeated. When dawn came on November 15th, the battle was over. The Japanese invasion force had been destroyed. The sea around Guadalcanal was littered with burning wrecks. For the first time, Allied command could say the island was secure. But Enterprise was not done. Her decks were cracked, her crew exhausted, and yet orders came in, prepare for the next operation. The war was far from over, and the Grey Ghost still had more to give. In the months that followed the Battle of Santa Cruz and Guadalcanal, Enterprise became something more than just a ship. She became a legend. Sailors began calling her the Grey Ghost, a name that spread from crew to fleet, whispered with or in mess halls and briefing rooms alike. The Japanese, unable to believe she had survived so many hits, began reporting her as destroyed again and again. Yet, every time, she returned to battle, rebuilt just enough to keep fighting. By early 1943, Enterprise was operating with minimal support. Other carriers were still under repair or newly built and not yet tested. That left her alone to cover vast sections of the Pacific. Every sortie she launched mattered. Every bomb she carried was another strike holding back an advancing enemy. Her decks bore scars that told her story, sections of steel that didn't quite match the original color, rivets uneven from emergency repairs, and patchwork welds that ran across her hull like stitches. Inside, corridors were narrower, darker, and hotter than before. The ship's ventilation systems had never been designed for such extended use without overhaul. Fans rattled. Pipes leaked. Yet the crew adapted. They ate standing up, slept in shifts, and fixed everything that broke with whatever tools or spare parts they could find. For Herschel Smith, life became a cycle of repair, anticipation, and battle readiness. Every morning began with inspections, often before sunrise. He would run his hand along bulkheads, feeling for vibration changes that signaled stress fractures. His teams carried notebooks filled with sketches, outlines of compartments, pressure readings, and temperature logs. If a sound seemed off, they traced it until they found the cause. If a valve stuck, they replaced it on the spot. It was exhausting work, but Smith understood one truth better than anyone. Enterprise could not afford a single mistake. Captain Hardison's leadership matched Smith's discipline. He demanded precision but never raised his voice. When he spoke, men listened. "This ship isn't alive because of steel," he once told the engineering crew during a night inspection. "It's alive because of you. Every bolt you tighten, every weld you lay down, that's another heartbeat for this ship." That spirit carried them through the long, grinding months of 1943. Battles erupted and faded across the Pacific. The Aleutians, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and Enterprise was there for nearly all of them. Her aircraft struck enemy positions, her gunners repelled surprise attacks, and her damage control teams faced constant emergencies. The enemy had learned from its earlier mistakes. New Japanese aircraft appeared, faster, heavier, deadlier. The A6M0 had been the terror of the early war, but now the Japanese were deploying the upgraded A6M5 and other prototypes. Pilots aboard Enterprise quickly adapted. They studied flight reports, exchanged tactics with Army Air Force units, and learned how to use altitude, speed, and teamwork to overcome superior numbers. Still, the price was high. Every victory came with losses. Planes failed to return, pilots went missing, and sometimes debris was all that floated back. The men on deck never asked questions. They simply cleared the landing zones, fueled the next aircraft, and kept the operation moving. By mid-1943, the ship's engines were showing signs of wear. Constant strain had begun to warp the turbine housings, and the heat from the boiler rooms was climbing beyond safety margins. Smith knew what that meant. A complete engine overhaul was long overdue. But with no replacement carrier available, the Navy couldn't afford to pull Enterprise from action. So he improvised. Working in 120-degree heat deep in the hull, his engineers constructed makeshift cooling lines using scavenged parts from damaged destroyers. They reinforced cracked turbine blades with welded braces. It wasn't standard procedure, it wasn't even approved, but it worked. For months, those jury-rigged systems kept the engines running. By autumn, word began to circulate through the fleet that Enterprise might finally be sent home for repairs. When the order came in October 1943, many of the crew didn't believe it. They had grown so accustomed to crisis that peace felt unnatural. But as she limped toward Pearl Harbor, tugs escorting her through calm waters, the men finally saw how battered their ship truly was. The flight deck sagged slightly in the middle. Patches of rust bled through the grey paint. Inside, sections of wiring had been replaced so many times that entire walls seemed to hum faintly from electricity. And yet, she had survived. When Enterprise entered dry dock, thousands of shipyard workers lined the pier. For the first time, the crew saw how the rest of the Navy viewed their ship, not as a vessel, but as a symbol. She had fought in nearly every major battle of the Pacific so far, taken more hits than any other carrier, and still returned. Over the next months, she was completely rebuilt. New plating replaced the scorched sections. Fresh wiring ran through the ship's veins. Engines were removed, cleaned, and refitted. Her deck was widened, her radar upgraded, her guns modernized. When the work was finished, she didn't just look new, she looked invincible. But deep down, the men who had been with her through the worst knew better. The Grey Ghost had earned her name not by being untouchable, but by refusing to disappear. And as they prepared to sail once more, they all knew one thing: the hardest battles were still ahead. In the spring of 1944, Enterprise once again cut through the Pacific, her hull gleaming with fresh paint and her engines humming with new power. The crew called her Enterprise II now, half joking, half serious, because she felt like a new ship altogether. But beneath that shine, the same spirit endured. The welders, the pilots, the mechanics, the cooks, most of them had been there since the desperate days of Guadalcanal. They knew every sound she made, every vibration of her decks. When the ocean was calm, they could even tell which engine was turning slightly faster than the others. Their mission this time was different. The war had changed. The United States was no longer fighting for survival. It was advancing. The Japanese Navy was retreating, slowly but fiercely, from island to island. The Pacific had turned into a vast chessboard, and Enterprise was the Queen Piece, mobile, powerful, and decisive. In June 1944, she joined the largest naval armada the world had ever seen, Task Force 58, as the Allies prepared to strike the Mariana Islands. The objective was clear: capture Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, to bring American bombers within range of Japan itself. But before the landings could begin, the carriers would face one of the most dramatic air battles in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. At dawn on June 19th, radar screens aboard Enterprise began to light up. Dozens of contacts appeared, then hundreds. The enemy had launched everything it had, a massive wave of carrier-based aircraft moving toward the American fleet. Pilots scrambled to their planes, deck crews ran to their stations, and the calm sea turned into a frenzy of motion. Enemy planes inbound, range 80 miles, came the announcement over the ship speakers. The voice was steady, calm, practiced. This wasn't panic. This was precision. From the flight deck, dozens of F-6F Hellcats roared into the sky. Their engines echoed like thunder as they climbed higher and higher, forming protective screens around the fleet. 4 hours, the air was filled with the rumble of engines, tracer fire, and smoke trails. The Japanese attack, what they called Operation Ago, was intended to crush the American carriers once and for all. But their pilots were no longer the elite veterans of 1941. Many were inexperienced, flying outdated tactics against better-trained American forces. The result was a disaster for Japan. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of the day, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, and only a handful of US planes were lost. Enterprise's pilots alone accounted for dozens of victories. But the real triumph wasn't just in the air. Below deck, Herschel Smith's engineering teams faced their own battle. Hours of high-speed maneuvering had pushed the ship's turbines to their limits. Temperatures in the boiler rooms climbed dangerously high, forcing men to work in suffocating heat. Yet no one left their post. Smith stood near the gauges, sweat soaking through his uniform, barking orders to keep the engines balanced. "She holds steady," he said through the intercom, his voice calm despite the chaos. "She's got more in her." That night, the crew gathered on the flight deck to look out over the dark ocean. Far in the distance, faint glows marked where burning enemy ships drifted. The air was still, and for the first time in days, no alarms rang. The men sat in silence, some cleaning their sidearms, others writing letters home by the faint light of the stars. The victory at the Philippine Sea changed everything. The Japanese carrier fleet, once the most feared force on the planet, was effectively destroyed. And Enterprise had been there at the center of it all, guiding the waves of aircraft, coordinating strikes, and surviving yet another round of close calls. But fate had more in store for the Grey Ghost. After months of continuous operations, she was chosen for something new, an experiment that would once again place her at the cutting edge of naval warfare. The US Navy had a new concept: night operations. Until then, carriers fought only in daylight, when pilots could see their targets and landing decks. Night meant grounding planes. But now, with radar and advanced navigation, the Navy wanted to see if an aircraft carrier could fight around the clock. And who better to test that idea than Enterprise, the ship that had already done the impossible? Her flight deck crews began new drills, this time under total darkness. Deck lights were dimmed, lanterns covered, and sailors practiced launching and recovering planes guided only by faint red glows and voice commands over radio. It was dangerous, far more dangerous than daytime flight operations. One mistake could send a plane overboard, or worse, crashing into the deck. But slowly, through endless practice, they began to perfect it. By late 1944, Enterprise had become the Navy's first true night carrier. Her air group could launch at sunset, strike enemy positions under the cover of darkness, and return long after midnight. The Japanese had no answer for it. Their ships and airfields were struck at times they thought safe. The Grey Ghost had found a new way to haunt her enemies. She took part in raids across the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, each mission pushing the limits of coordination and courage. Her pilots returned guided by radar beacons, landing blind onto a blacked-out deck that swayed in heavy seas. Every landing was a test of nerve and trust. Smith, now promoted to chief engineer, sometimes stood on the deck at night, watching the planes land. The glow of their exhausts traced orange arcs through the dark sky. Each successful landing felt like a small miracle. "She's not just a ship," he told one of his men. "She's a heartbeat that never stops." By early 1945, Enterprise had been at war longer than any other carrier still afloat. Her name carried weight, not just in the Navy, but across the entire Allied world. She had become a symbol of persistence, a reminder that even when outnumbered, outgunned, or battered beyond reason, resolve could turn the tide. But soon, she would face one last great test, a storm of a different kind. By the spring of 1945, Enterprise had been in almost constant action for 3 years. From the dark days of 1942 to the massive offensives of 1945, she had carried the war across the Pacific closer and closer to Japan itself. But with victory finally on the horizon came a new, desperate threat, one that would test even the Grey Ghost's endurance. The new enemy weapon was both simple and terrifying: the kamikaze. Pilots, many barely out of training, were ordered to crash their planes directly into American ships. The tactic was born of desperation, but it was brutally effective. Even a single hit could cripple a carrier. And in April 1945, during the fierce fighting around Okinawa, Enterprise was about to face that reality. On the morning of April 11th, the air was heavy with haze. The sea was calm, almost unnervingly so, as the ship's radar picked up scattered enemy contacts moving toward the fleet. The crew had grown used to alerts, but this time the pattern looked different. Smaller groups, flying low, coming in fast. Bogies inbound, bearing 090, The voice over the intercom called out. The anti-aircraft crews ran to their guns, loaders dragging fresh belts of ammunition. Pilots scrambled to their planes, engines roaring to life. The tension was electric. Everyone knew what was coming. Moments later, the first wave appeared on the horizon. Small, single-engine planes diving straight toward the fleet. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, bursts of black smoke and tracer rounds chasing the attackers. Some planes were shredded midair, bursting into flame and falling into the sea. But one slipped through. It came in low, fast, almost skimming the waves. The gunners aboard Enterprise hit it repeatedly, but it kept coming, trailing smoke. At the last second, it rose slightly and struck near the forward elevator, the same section that had been damaged years earlier at Santa Cruz. The explosion tore through the deck, blowing debris high into the air. Flames shot up instantly. Below deck, chaos erupted. The impact had ignited aviation fuel lines and electrical circuits. Smoke filled the compartments, and for a moment, it seemed the entire forward section might go up in flames. But then, as always, the crew's training took over. Damage control teams sprinted to the scene, sealing hatches, flooding compartments to contain the fire. Smith's voice echoed through the intercom. Starboard pumps on full. Secure the forward lines. His men worked in suffocating heat, dragging hoses through narrow corridors, their boots sloshing in knee-deep water. Above them, sailors on the flight deck beat back flames with foam extinguishers and sand. Within 20 minutes, the fire was under control. Within an hour, the flames were out. Smoke still drifted from the ruptured deck, but Enterprise was alive. She was wounded, yes, her forward elevator completely destroyed, much of her flight deck buckled, yet she still turned into the wind, ready to recover her returning aircraft. That night, as the fires cooled, Smith and Captain Hardison stood together on the deck, looking at the damage. The steel was warped and blackened, the smell of burned paint thick in the air. "She's taken worse," Smith said quietly. Hardison nodded. "And she'll sail again." The next morning, temporary repairs began. With no time to return to port, the crew built a wooden platform over the damaged section, allowing limited flight operations to continue. It was crude, improvised, but it worked. Within 48 hours, Enterprise was launching aircraft again. News spread quickly through the fleet. The Grey Ghost is back. Other ships flashed light signals in salute as she passed. Even in her battered state, she was a symbol, a reminder that resilience itself was a weapon. Over the following weeks, she continued operations off Okinawa, launching strikes and night missions even as kamikaze attacks intensified. Every day brought new alarms, new threats, new near misses. And yet, every evening, Enterprise still stood in the sunset, her deck crew waving as returning planes touched down, the sound of engines fading into the night. But on May 14th, her luck finally ran out. It began as another typical morning. Calm sea, light wind, a faint mist on the horizon. Just before noon, a lone radar contact appeared, a single plane, fast-moving, approaching from the northeast. The gunners were ready. They had faced dozens of similar attacks, but this one came out of the sun. By the time the lookout spotted it, the plane was already diving. Tracers laced the sky, but the attacker didn't waver. It struck near the aft section of the flight deck, its impact throwing men off their feet and sending a shockwave through the entire ship. This time, the damage was worse. The explosion knocked out the power grid in several compartments and jammed the rear elevator. Fires burned in multiple decks. The flight deck, already weakened from earlier repairs, began to sag under its own weight. For 2 days, the crew fought to keep the ship afloat. Smith and his teams worked around the clock, patching bulkheads, rerouting power, keeping pumps running despite failing systems. When exhaustion threatened to take over, they poured coffee straight from the pot and kept going. Finally, on May 16th, the order came. Enterprise would withdraw for repairs. She had fought her last battle. As the ship turned away from Okinawa, the crew gathered silently on the deck. The smell of burnt metal still lingered, and the sky above was streaked with smoke from distant fires. But there was pride, too, a deep, unspoken pride. They had done what no other carrier had. Through 3 years of war, 20 major battles, and countless repairs, Enterprise had never been sunk, never been beaten into submission. She had outlasted the war's darkest hours and carried the fight to its final front. The Grey Ghost had survived everything, even the storm of fire from the sky. When Enterprise left Okinawa, her decks were blackened, her elevators jammed, and her hull still bleeding fuel from patched seams. Yet as she made her slow journey back to the repair docks at Ulithi, she remained under her own power, engines humming steadily, as if determined to finish the war she had fought longer than any other ship. For the sailors aboard, those weeks felt strangely quiet. After years of battle alarms, carrier launches, and constant danger, the silence was almost unsettling. Men walked the scorched decks where bomb marks still showed. The flight crew cleaned what they could, repainting the areas where soot had settled, while mechanics catalogued the endless list of repairs still needed. When she finally arrived at Ulithi, the damage was fully revealed in daylight. Her bow plating was twisted, her elevators warped, and sections of the hangar deck so torn that sunlight poured through the gaps. The shipyard team stood speechless for a moment. They had seen battle damage before, but this was different. Enterprise looked like she had fought a dozen wars at once. Repair crews swarmed aboard immediately. Hundreds of men with cutting torches, cranes, and welding gear began the massive task of rebuilding her one last time. Smith oversaw the process personally. He moved through the ship's innards with the familiarity of a man checking an old friend's pulse. "She'll make it," he said, not as a question, but as a certainty. But fate had already decided otherwise. While the ship sat in dock, word came through: the war was ending. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had forced Japan to surrender. The fighting that had consumed the Pacific for nearly 4 years was over. When the announcement reached Enterprise, the reaction was unlike anything the Navy had ever seen. Cheers erupted across the decks, sailors embraced, hats flew into the air. Some men cried openly, others just stood quietly, staring out over the ocean. For many of them, this ship had been their entire world, their home, their hope, their survival. The Enterprise had outlasted the war. By the time the formal surrender was signed in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, Enterprise was still in dry dock. Her repairs were nearly complete, but she was too late to take part in the ceremony. Instead, she remained moored quietly at Ulithi, her decks lined with sailors standing at attention as news came over the radio. The war was over, but for the Grey Ghost, it was also the end of her purpose. In the months that followed, she ferried returning servicemen home as part of Operation Magic Carpet. Thousands of young men who had fought on distant islands and in the skies over the Pacific came aboard to make the journey back to the United States. Many of them didn't even realize they were standing on the most decorated ship in American history. They only knew it was called Enterprise and that it was taking them home. For Smith, it was a bittersweet time. The engines he had once pushed beyond limits now ran smoothly and quietly, guiding the ship across peaceful seas. The damage control drills were over. The fire alarms were silent. His men no longer carried axes and hoses. They carried duffel bags and photographs, ready to see families they hadn't seen in years. When Enterprise reached New York Harbor in late 1945, crowds gathered along the waterfront. Flags waved, bands played, and planes flew overhead in tribute. The ship that had fought at Midway, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa, the ship the Japanese had declared destroyed 3 times, was home at last. She had traveled more than 275,000 miles during the war, participated in 18 of the 22 major carrier battles of the Pacific, and earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American vessel. She had launched thousands of aircraft, helped sink or damage over 250 enemy ships, and brought countless airmen back alive. For a brief moment, she was a national hero. Newspapers called her the fightingest ship in the fleet. Photographs of her battered hull appeared on magazine covers. Even those who knew little about naval warfare knew the name Enterprise. But as months passed, attention drifted elsewhere. The war was over, and America wanted to move on. The Navy began downsizing, decommissioning older ships, and redirecting resources to new technologies. Carriers were evolving again, now larger, faster, and designed for the jet age. In February 1947, Enterprise was officially decommissioned. Her crew gathered one last time on the deck, lined in rows beneath the flag that had flown through every storm and battle. The ceremony was brief. When the colors were lowered, silence fell across the ship. Many men stayed long after the crowd dispersed, running their hands along the cold steel, whispering quiet farewells. Smith retired soon after. For him, leaving Enterprise felt like saying goodbye to a living being. "She took care of us," he told a young officer during his final inspection. "Now it's our turn to take care of her." But the world had other plans. For years, veterans and naval historians campaigned to preserve Enterprise as a museum, a memorial to the countless men who had served aboard her. Newspapers printed appeals, committees formed, donations were collected. But post-war America had little patience for monuments. Funding fell short, interest faded, and plans stalled again and again. Finally, in 1958, the unthinkable happened. The Navy sold the most decorated ship in its history to a scrap company in New Jersey. By 1960, she was gone, dismantled piece by piece, melted down into steel ingots, her remains scattered across civilian industries. A legend had vanished not in battle, but in silence. Yet the spirit of enterprise didn't die with the ship. Her bell was sent to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. Her sternplate was mounted in New Jersey, and her anchor displayed at the Washington Navy Yard. Every sailor who had served aboard carried a part of her memory. And decades later, when a new generation of carriers rose from American shipyards, one name returned again and again: Enterprise. The legacy would continue. When the original Enterprise was scrapped, many of her former crewmen refused to accept it. To them, she wasn't just a ship, she was a symbol of endurance, courage, and ingenuity. They had watched her survive the impossible again and again, and the idea that she could simply vanish into scrapyard silence felt wrong. Yet in some strange way, that quiet end only deepened her legend. Across the United States, veterans who had served aboard the Grey Ghost began meeting in small reunions, gatherings held in VFW halls, community centers, and seaside towns. They shared stories over coffee, bringing the ship back to life with every memory. Someone would talk about Midway, another about the heat of the boiler rooms at Santa Cruz, another about the day the sky over Okinawa burned orange with incoming aircraft. One thing united all their stories: the sense that Enterprise had been alive. The way her hull vibrated when she turned hard into the wind, the hum of her engines through the deck plates, the peculiar creak in the bulkhead near the mess hall that only the old crew remembered. She wasn't just steel and rivets, she had a heartbeat. In 1961, that heartbeat returned in a new form. The Navy commissioned the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Enterprise, CVN-65. She was vast, sleek, and unlike anything that had ever sailed before. Her 8 nuclear reactors gave her virtually unlimited range. Her deck could launch jet aircraft faster and heavier than anything from the war years. She was the embodiment of post-war American power. When word reached the surviving veterans of the original ship, many felt a surge of pride. They attended the launching ceremony, standing shoulder to shoulder as the new carrier slid into the water. Some of them wept openly when they saw the name painted across her bow, Enterprise. The legacy was alive. This new Enterprise would go on to serve for half a century, through the Cold War, the Vietnam conflict, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. She was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, patrolled the Indian Ocean during tense standoffs, and carried aircraft that were faster, louder, and deadlier than anything imagined in 1942. But even with all her modern technology, the spirit aboard was the same. Her sailors told stories of the Grey Ghost, passing them down like folklore. "Remember the old Enterprise," a chief petty officer might say to a new recruit. "The one that wouldn't quit, no matter what." It became a tradition, an invisible thread connecting generations of sailors separated by decades. The lessons of Herschel Smith and his damage control teams, precision, preparation, and absolute calm under pressure, were still taught in Navy training schools. His methods, once born from desperation, had become doctrine. Even naval engineers studying ship survivability referenced the case of Enterprise, how a carrier that should have been sunk multiple times stayed afloat because of crew discipline and superior design. Her very story helped shape the Navy that came after her. In the 1970s, historians began to rediscover her tale. Declassified reports from World War II revealed the full extent of her damage at Santa Cruz, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa, and how close she had come to disaster. Photographs once hidden in archives showed her scorched decks, twisted elevators, and patched hulls, all still afloat. Books and documentaries followed. The world began to understand that the most dangerous warship of World War II wasn't the one with the biggest guns or thickest armor, it was the one that refused to give up. The nickname Grey Ghost returned to popular memory. Naval museums featured exhibits dedicated to her. Model kits of Enterprise sold around the world, her silhouette instantly recognizable, the long flat deck, the starboard island, the unmistakable E on her tail markings. By the late 20th century, she had become something more than a ship. She was an idea. The concept that resilience could be more powerful than raw strength. That leadership, discipline, and courage could turn even damaged steel into a weapon of history. In interviews with surviving veterans, One sentiment was repeated again and again. She was lucky, they'd say, smiling faintly. But when pressed further, they'd shake their heads.
No.
Not luck. She had people who never quit. That's what kept her alive. When the nuclear-powered Enterprise was finally decommissioned in 2017, her crew held a ceremony remarkably similar to that of her predecessor. Flags lowered, decks cleared, sailors lined in silence. And once again, many old veterans came, some in wheelchairs, some holding photographs of the ship they'd served on in the 1940s. As the last notes of the Navy hymn played, they looked at the massive steel hull before them and whispered the same words, "The name lives on." It was more than sentiment. It was prophecy. Because even then, the Navy had already begun constructing another, the Enterprise, CVN-80, a Ford-class supercarrier, a direct descendant of both the nuclear-powered and original warship. Larger than any before her, she was designed to serve deep into the 21st century. And on her bow, just like all those before, would stand a single word that had become a legend in itself: Enterprise. The legacy was unbroken. The story of Enterprise is not just about a ship, it's about what people are capable of when everything seems lost. When her decks burned and her hull twisted, it wasn't luck that kept her afloat. It was the hands of ordinary sailors who refused to stop working. It was welders who stayed at their torches until their gloves smoked. It was officers like Herschel Smith, who saw past chaos and found solutions when none should have existed. That spirit, the refusal to yield, became her real armor. Every time Enterprise was declared gone, she came back. When the Japanese claimed she was at the bottom of the ocean, she reappeared over the horizon, launching aircraft. When her decks were torn apart, she fought again within days. She wasn't designed to be indestructible, yet somehow, she acted like she was. And the men aboard her came to believe it too. For them, she wasn't just a ship, she was something alive. Sailors spoke to her in the quiet moments before dawn. Pilots touched the deck before takeoff, whispering short prayers, trusting that she would bring them back. She carried tens of thousands of men through the worst moments of the Pacific War, and somehow, she always brought more of them home than anyone could explain. Even when her physical form was gone, melted down and scattered, Enterprise didn't fade. She lived in stories told by veterans to their children, in yellowed photographs kept in drawers, in logbooks and ship diaries tucked away in archives. Every time a historian opens one of those pages and reads about the night at Guadalcanal, or the desperate hours after Santa Cruz, the grey ghost sails again. Her legacy changed the Navy itself. The emphasis on damage control, redundant systems, and crew training that saved Enterprise became standard for every new carrier class. Her survival proved that a ship's greatest weapon wasn't its guns or aircraft, it was the skill and determination of its crew. That idea shaped generations of sailors. It's why, decades later, the word Enterprise was chosen again, not because it sounded heroic, but because it meant something. It represented persistence, innovation, and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest hour, there's a way forward. Every carrier that bears the name inherits that duty. The nuclear enterprise of the Cold War carried it through 5 decades of global tension, her sailors facing new kinds of battles, invisible, political, and psychological. The next Enterprise, CVN-80, will carry it into the future, into an era of technology the original crew could never have imagined. Yet the heart will remain the same, the belief that a ship is only as strong as the people who serve on her. When visitors stand before Enterprise's preserved relics, her bell at the Naval Academy, her anchor at the Washington Navy Yard, they aren't just looking at metal. They're looking at echoes of every man who ran through smoke-filled corridors, every pilot who took off from her deck knowing he might not return, every mechanic who turned a wrench while the deck trembled from nearby explosions. Those pieces of steel still carry the energy of what they endured. And maybe that's the reason she's remembered as the most dangerous American warship of World War II. Not because she destroyed the most ships or carried the most planes, but because she embodied something far more powerful: endurance. She was dangerous to her enemies because they couldn't understand her. They saw a ship declared lost, yet days later, she was back, striking again. To them, she was unnatural, a phantom carrier, a ghost of grey steel that refused to vanish. But what they were really seeing was something deeply human: resolve. The same resolve that built her, sailed her, repaired her, and saved her again and again. Today, nearly a century after her keel was first laid, the name Enterprise still sails. It crosses oceans, it appears in films, books, and even dreams of exploration beyond Earth itself. It has become shorthand for adventure, courage, and endurance. But at its core, it remains the story of one ship and the men who made her unstoppable. She began as just another carrier. She became the symbol of an entire generation's strength. The Grey Ghost, the ship that refused to sink. And though her decks are gone, her spirit still moves with every tide. Whenever a new carrier turns into the wind and launches its first aircraft, somewhere deep in the steel and salt of the ocean, the name Enterprise stirs again, steady, unyielding, eternal.